2 days ago in Auckland, New Zealand, Kelly J. Keane, a women's rights activist, was physically assaulted at her Let Women Speak event. She had called it Let Women Speak because she believes that women who have concerns about their sex-based rights are often silenced. And in an effort to disprove her arguments, large groups of angry men turned up to stop her from speaking. Here's an example of some of the protesters in action. I can't think why women would want men like this out of their spaces. Clearly, they must be evil bigots. It's the only explanation. Well, that was the conclusion of most of the Australian and New Zealand media. Newshub, a major New Zealand TV channel, decided that it would smear the Let Women Speak event as anti-trans. This is something, by the way, that both The Guardian and the Daily Mail have also done this weekend, which is a reminder that the culture war has nothing to do with left or right. That said, Newshub took it a step further, defaming Kelly J. Keane, also known as Posey Parker, as a white supremacist. In other words, rather than engage in actual journalism, they uncritically repeated the accusations of the most dishonest of Keane's critics. Great job, guys. Here's what they had to say.
Immigration New Zealand has decided to allow the controversial anti-trans campaigner known as Posey Parker into New Zealand. They reviewed her case on safety grounds after her rally in Melbourne attracted neo-Nazis.
Now, it is true that there were neo-Nazis at the Let Women Speak rally in Melbourne, but as the Australian Jewish Council noted, these were thugs who saw an opportunity to hijack the event for their own publicity. In fact, the neo-Nazis were clashing with Socialist Alliance, a supposedly anti-fascist group, who nonetheless seemed to be more concerned with shutting down a women's gathering than confronting, you know, the actual fascists. And yet, because these opportunistic neo-Nazi miscreants had gatecrashed the event, the Australian media conflated them with the women, claiming that they were allies. Because, of course, fascists are well known for their profound concern for women's safeguarding. Anyway, let's get back to Newshub and their incredibly sophisticated journalism.
Has issued direct threats to the Prime Minister.
I tell you what, Chris.
Using a hand signal linked to white supremacists, which we've chosen to blur.
Revoke my visa. At your peril.
Wait, what? Kelly J. Keane has previously described white supremacy and racism as having no place in a civilised society. So if she was lying about that and wanted to keep her evil views secret, why would she start making overt white power gestures with her hand? None of this makes sense until you take away the blurring effect that Newshub have put on the clip. Newshub would like you to believe that this is the OK symbol, which has been co-opted by certain far-right groups. But when you watch the original footage, you can see she's just adjusting the zip on her top.
Let me just tell you this. Revoke my visa. At your peril.
But of course, by blurring it out, Newshub can make it look a lot more sinister. As the commentator and podcaster Stephen Knight pointed out on his latest Substack, in that same video, Keane goes on to defend the speech rights of Maori women. As Knight puts it, that's an odd flex for someone intending to signal to their white supremacist supporters. Of course, defamation is a common tactic nowadays. People don't want to engage in discussion, so they make up lies instead. But if you're going to lie, at least make it vaguely plausible. Newshub are openly misleading their viewers, presumably because they think their viewers are too stupid to know how to use a search engine. Well, job done. The lies have been spread, the temperature has been raised, and this is the result. So this footage is from the Let Women Speak event in Auckland, and there's also now footage circulating online of an elderly female attendee being punched at full force in the face by one of the protesters. Like all bullies, they pick on the weakest targets. The footage itself is actually too disturbing for us to show. No police were present, just a baying mob, mostly men, pushing, shoving and screaming abuse at one woman. If the stewards hadn't been so courageous, Keane could have been killed. And that, of course, is where all of this is leading. We are continually hearing that there is bad behaviour on both sides of this debate. I'm sorry, this is just not sustainable anymore. I've seen a few women's rights campaigners use abusive terms, throwing insults, and yes, behaving badly. But I've never seen women's rights campaigners sending death threats, rape threats, or attempting to punch anyone who takes an opposing view. Yet we see this all the time from trans activists. Not trans people, by the way, most of whom want to get on with their lives in peace and are extremely ill-served by these so-called allies who claim to represent them. J.K. Rowling, who has never said anything transphobic in her life, is nonetheless smeared as a hateful bigot and inundated on a daily basis with death threats. She has said she received so many that she could paper the house with them. And this is the point. It isn't just one or two bad apples. This kind of behaviour is the norm in this particular activist community. If you don't believe me, you can take a look at the website turfisaslur.com, where you can see hundreds of screenshots of violent threats and imagery against women campaigning for their rights. I won't show the worst ones here, they're far too disturbing, but here are some of the milder examples. Any trans allies at Pride London right now need to step the F up and take out the TERF trash. Get in their faces, make them afraid. Debate never works, so F them up. If you're a TERF, you can get F'd with the business end of the barbed wire baseball bat. Stab a TERF today. Remember to twist the knife and then remove it. These examples go on and on and on and on. And you know who doesn't post messages like this? Women. And yet many of the people issuing these threats want us to believe that they are women. It's hardly the most persuasive tactic. Here's what one activist wrote after watching the violence in Auckland. I got turned on today watching the fear in Posey Parker's eyes. She actually was fearing for her life. And you know who doesn't get sexually aroused by mob violence? Women. And most men, as it happens, but definitely not women. And yet so many mainstream commentators refuse to condemn these activists. They think this is simply a fragile, marginalised group standing up for themselves. A group so marginalised that they have the support of all major corporations and public institutions, are able to call on the police to arrest those who refuse to use the language that they demand, and are able to bully and physically assault women who are gathering peacefully to express their views. And the media and political class cheer them on. And this is entirely backward, and it has to stop, because somebody is going to get seriously hurt. Look at this post from a couple of days ago by Stephen Shaviro, an academic at Wayne State University in Detroit. So here is what I think about free speech on campus. Although I do not advocate violating federal and state criminal codes, I think it is far more admirable to kill a racist, homophobic or transphobic speaker than it is to shout them down. That's an actual professor working at an actual university. Now, there are many obvious objections to this. Firstly, that murder is never justifiable. Secondly, it's probably not a great idea to be openly advocating for murder on your Facebook page. I mean, it's not a great endorsement for the institution, is it? Come to Wayne State University, kids, where you can be taught by total sociopaths. But what Shaviro fails to take into account is that virtually everyone who is branded a racist, homophobe or transphobe these days is nothing of the kind. And in that context, when these terms are so misused so often, surely it's a little unwise to be claiming that murdering anyone so described is admirable. And the history books are full of this kind of thing. People demonising certain groups as subhuman in order to justify appalling violence and atrocities. If you call someone a TERF, they're no longer a human being. They're a cockroach, and cockroaches can be crushed. We are dealing with an ideological movement which is largely composed of fantasists who see Nazis in every shadow, who monster anyone who doesn't think it's fair for women to compete with biological males in sport, or anyone who doesn't think violent male rapists ought to be accommodated in women's prisons, or anyone who understands that sex is binary and that speaking the truth still matters. In other words, the people these activists consider to be mortal enemies, these Nazis of the imagination, comprise the overwhelming majority of the public. And that's a lot of Nazis. And this is the context in which Kellie J. Keane has been smeared, first by activists, then by the mainstream press. We are told that women's rights is a Trojan horse for fascism. And this misapprehension was made explicit in this cartoon in the New Zealand Herald. Here you can see Kellie J. Keane depicted as a large wooden horse surrounded by neo-Nazis. I have to say, I don't think this cartoonist understands what a Trojan horse is. I doubt very much the Greeks would have made it into the city of Troy if they'd been standing outside the horse. It kind of defeats the purpose. Surely the Trojan horse metaphor would work much better for individuals who, I don't know, claim to be compassionate and on the right side of history, but routinely send threats of death and rape to anyone who challenges their worldview. Gender identity ideology is often presented as sweet and cuddly with glitter and rainbow flags and be kind hashtags. But like the Trojan horse, there are plenty of angry men inside waiting to commit bloody carnage. So in this section of Free Speech Nation, I want to discuss this issue with two fantastic guests. I have today the author Ella Whelan here in the studio, and down the line, Helen Joyce, Director of Advocacy at Sex Matters. Welcome both. Ella, I want to come to you first. So we've all seen this footage, absolutely horrific footage in New Zealand. Posey Parker or Kelly J. Keane is having this Let Women Speak event, and protesters turn up, the police are absent, and it turns violent. What is happening here? Why is this becoming more common?
Well, I just think it's remarkable that you have, politicians in New Zealand very sort of seriously discussing banning Kelly Jane Keane from entering because of the supposed dangers that she poses, and then failing to provide any kind of security, any kind of police presence for what was very clearly from the start going to be a violent, they themselves said there's probably going to be violence at this event. Yes. And so then, there's a very clear decision being made there, which is that the kind of pretend danger is the one they care about, but the real danger posed to the women that took part in that rally is nothing to worry about. And I don't know what you call that other than a certain kind of judgment that women who hold these kind of views don't matter. I mean, Posey Parker, Kelly Jane Keane has often said that she is the wrong kind of woman, and there's a real, I think, uncomfortable question for a lot of people who are involved in the sort of gender critical discussions about the fact that she has seen the rough end of this kind of campaign for a very long time. Yes. With sort of limited solidarity, and unless women like her stick their neck out on the line, quite literally. I mean, it's remarkable reading The Guardian saying they described what happened to her as she was doused in tomato soup. As if it was like someone just poured a friendly can over her head.
And as if this whole thing wasn't filmed and people can check it for themselves. Yeah. This was a scary, violent, intimidating event. Yeah,
but I think that I think she's to be commended for the fact that she continues to go out. She does, and there are lots of, the reason why this is so important was because there is a big debate to be had about how we respond to a kind of trans ideology. Some people think that, Posey Parker's in-your-face way of doing it is, I think, probably in some circumstances at this point, it's probably the only way to do it. Some people take a sort of different view in terms of how we handle gender ideology. But what there should be no argument about is that when women try and organise a space for them to talk about, literally having the word woman erased in lots of areas of public life, yes. That you don't get decked. That's probably the bare minimum.
I would have thought. Yeah. Let's bring in Helen Joyce on this very question. Helen, thanks so much for joining us. I do want to ask you about that question. That a lot of the protesters are the kinds of activists who will say that words are violence, and that Posey Parker's very presence there is tantamount to violence. And of course, this is perhaps a means by which they can justify their own authentically violent acts.
I think they think that they can. Their activism is super linguistic, funnily, although it's backed up with physical violence. And they think that if they can silence you, they don't need to even turn up to a protest. And that has worked remarkably well over the last several years. I think what we're seeing now is that women standing up for their rights are starting to make some headway. So just the day before Posey was threatened so horribly in New Zealand, we saw World Athletics finally say that men who call themselves women are not allowed to compete in women's sports. And that was great. We had 24 hours of being really cheerful here and praising the campaigners who had worked so hard to make this happen. And then we see this. So I think the violence is because the silencing hasn't worked. I mean, there's a very classed way of talking about Posey. So Posey isn't invited, as I was last year, to Cambridge colleges to say exactly the same thing. I say the same thing as her. I say that men cannot be women and that women cannot have rights unless women can say that anywhere they like. She stands in a park and says it, and I've been to some of her events and I stand completely with her. I get invited to a Cambridge college. There are still baying mobs. The policing and the managing of these events is equally poor in both circumstances in this country, even worse in New Zealand, but we are doing the same thing. The people who think that Posey is maybe too populist or that she in some way brings it on herself, well, I bring it on myself too then. I stand completely with her. I'm just doing it in a different place, that's all.
I mean, a lot of the violence is justified because what they say is that she is a Nazi, she is far right, and these kind of smears are used to justify the violence. I want to just bring in for both of you, there was an event today in Hyde Park. It was the monthly Let Women Speak event. It just happens to have fallen just after this event. And Graham Linehan, the comedy writer, was present, and he actually filmed the police walking away. I wonder if we can see...
Okay, so I'm just approaching it now. Bunch of cops over here, walking away. Look at that, walking away. And meanwhile, this is going on over here. These men are intimidating women, and these policemen are walking away.
And then just to put that into context, we actually have some footage from what was going on within the women's gathering there, if we can just show that as well. OK, so Ella, can I just ask you about this? So there we have the people speaking at Hyde Park, Speaker's Corner, which is what it's designed for, completely surrounded by protesters chanting, "The only good Nazi is a dead one." It strikes me that this tactic of smearing someone as a Nazi and then using that to justify violent behaviour, that seems to be the way it's going.
Yeah, well, if we lived in a kind of normal world where we didn't throw labels around like this all the time and didn't take them so seriously, you would say like, this is such an incredibly childish way of responding politically to someone. The kind of, you know, I've seen them when I've gone to protests, these kind of trans activists are often overgrown teenagers who've never been told no in their life, and that's part of why they respond this way. But if, you know, the police are the people that are supposed to take seriously threats of violence. I mean, they lock people up all the time for doing very much less on social media. But, you know, they're in an awkward position now because they are supposed to be, you know, jailing people for writing limericks about trans ideology. So then it's awkward for them to go in and then arrest those very same people who are literally calling for threats on women's lives. And I think you need to make a very clear point here of saying in any other situation that wasn't related to the trans discussion, if women were being threatened in this way, it would be we would be talking about it for months. You know, it would be all over every single newspaper. But because, and Helen makes a very good point, because it's to the gender ideology and because it's Posy Parker, who has a particular kind of, you know, no-nonsense working-class way about her that doesn't, you know, sticks in a lot of people's craws, especially even within the gender-critical movement, no one wants to know.
Helen, can I ask you for your response to that? I mean, we saw the police walking away and failing to do anything about it. That was in London today. That was just a few hours ago. What's your response to that?
So one of my friends was there. Graham is also a friend, but I haven't spoken to him since. And she said it was completely terrifying. They were surrounded. She got there before most other people, and there were about 8 of them completely surrounded. And then when some more women turned up, they felt a bit better. But again, they got hemmed in. The police didn't seem to care. The one that I was at in Brighton most recently, we couldn't be heard. Like, we could only be heard on the live stream, not in person, because the shouting was so loud over us. You know, that's not free speech. The police said apparently to the stewards today that it's the free speech of the protesters to be able to shout over women with their, you know, the vuvuzelas and the megaphones. That's not free speech. That's the heckler's veto. They should be moved back so that we can be heard and not feel so intimidated. I should say that a bunch of women's rights campaigners and gay rights campaigners and general free speech groups like the Free Speech Union, Sex Matters, LGB Alliance and others have written to the UK government and asked it to make representations to the New Zealand High Commissioner, asking how come our citizens aren't able to go to New Zealand and be protected by the police from this sort of violent threat and then have to leave early rather than being able to exercise ordinary democratic rights to talk to each other. And I hope we get a response. From now on, I'm going to be going to every single one of these events that I possibly can, and I call on everyone else to do so too, because if women cannot stand in a public place and say in any ordinary words they like, men cannot be women, and if you say they can be women, then you are destroying women's rights, then we do not have any women's rights. So we have to start saying it, even if we're scared.
And finally, Ella, because we don't have much time, but I just want to ask you, given the kind of footage that we've been showing tonight, given that it doesn't look as though you can possibly reason with these people, that they are caught up in some kind of hysteria where they do genuinely see everyone as Nazis, how can we possibly address this issue?
I think people have to start finding their mettle and standing alongside women who say these kind of things. And if you get called a transphobe and if you get into hot water in whatever part of your life, then so be it. I think there are things that are more important and that we have to sacrifice certain things in our life for, like, you know, saying things that are true, that women are women and men are men. And also I think we need to start calling out the police. I mean, I used to live in Brighton and there was the annual EDL march, and it would be sort of like 6 drunk EDL members surrounded, protected by about 45 police, and then there was, you know, we would be on a counter demonstration. But you know, the idea that this is just how the police operate is an absolute nonsense. It's not that I want more coppers around protests, and I think free speech is very important, as you well know, on this show. But there's something going on here where there's a real cowardice in actually confronting the fact that in pretty much all areas of life, whether it's on the media, in newspapers, in workplaces, you know, even people among friends, women aren't able to talk about this, and something needs to change.
Ella Whelan and Helen Joyce, thank you both for joining me very much.